Barbara Payton died on May 8, 1967 in a San Diego flophouse, 39 years old, her body destroyed by alcohol and abandonment. 17 years earlier, in 1950, Life magazine had called her Hollywood's newest blonde goddess. 17 years. That's all Barbara got between being crowned and being discarded. 17 years from magazine covers and studio contracts to dying forgotten in a rented room. Her beauty ravaged, her career annihilated, her name reduced to a cautionary tale whispered on casting couches. Don't end up like Barbara Payton. But here's what those whispers never acknowledged. Barbara didn't destroy herself. Hollywood destroyed her. The same industry that photographed her, marketed her, profited from her beauty, then threw her away the moment she became inconvenient. She was a product, used until she stopped being profitable, then discarded like yesterday's contract. May 8, 1967. A rundown San Diego apartment. Barbara's body was found by the landlord who'd come looking for overdue rent. Heart failure, liver failure, the clinical terms for organs that had given up after years of systematic abuse. She was 39 but looked 60, bloated, prematurely aged, unrecognizable as the luminous blonde who'd stood beside James Cagney on Warner Brothers sound stages just 17 years earlier. No studio sent flowers to her funeral. No former co-stars attended. The woman who'd once been called a goddess died with less ceremony than most civilians, mourned by a handful of people and forgotten by the industry that had created her. But rewind to 1950. Barbara Payton at 22, platinum blonde, impossibly beautiful, her face filling movie screens across America and Kiss Tomorrow Goodbye. Critics praised her performance. Audiences couldn't look away. Warner Brothers executives saw dollar signs and planned her next 5 films. She was going to be huge. The next big thing, the blonde bombshell who'd define the decade. What they didn't see, what nobody cared to see, was the fragility underneath all that beauty. Barbara wasn't just gorgeous. She was vulnerable in ways that made her perfect for exploitation and catastrophic for survival. She needed approval desperately, believed every promise from powerful men, had no protection or support system. Hollywood didn't want to address those vulnerabilities. Hollywood wanted to package them as sex appeal, to market her neediness as desire, to use her beauty until it stopped selling, then move on to the next blonde goddess without looking back. The cruelest irony of Barbara Payton's life is that the title of her biggest film, Kiss Tomorrow Goodbye, became her prophecy. She kissed tomorrow goodbye in 1951 when scandal destroyed her career. She spent the next 16 years watching that tomorrow recede further and further away, until finally there were no tomorrows left, just a San Diego flophouse and a body that couldn't take any more punishment. But to understand how a rising star became a ghost story, how beauty became a death sentence instead of a blessing, we need to go back to the beginning. To Minnesota, 1927. To a girl named Barbara Lee Redfield who had no idea that being beautiful would ultimately kill her. Barbara Lee Redfield was born November 16, 1927 in Cloquet, Minnesota. A small mill town where beauty was appreciated but not weaponized, where being pretty might help you find a husband but wouldn't necessarily destroy your life. Her family was working class, ordinary, giving young Barbara no preparation whatsoever for the machinery that would later consume her. She was a pretty child who became a beautiful teenager, the kind of beauty that made people stop and stare, that suggested futures beyond Minnesota. At 16, she married a local boy. By 17, she had a son. She was playing the role small-town America expected, young wife, young mother settling into conventional life. But the marriage was wrong from the start, too young, too limiting, too small for whatever Barbara sensed she was meant to become. By 18, she was divorced with a baby, which in 1945 America carried heavy stigma and judgment. She needed money desperately, needed escape, needed something beyond the suffocating expectations of cloquet. So she did what beautiful girls with limited options and big dreams often did. She went to Hollywood. Not necessarily with grand ambitions of stardom, she wasn't that naive, but with the practical hope that beauty could be currency, that her face might buy her a better life than waitressing in Minnesota while raising a child alone. She was 19 years old, carrying a small suitcase and enormous vulnerability, stepping off a bus into a city designed to devour girls exactly like her. Could anyone have predicted this vulnerable teenager would become a symbol of Hollywood's darkest machinery? The warning signs were obvious to anyone who cared to look. Desperate need for validation, willingness to trust promises, lack of any support system or protection. A baby back in Minnesota depending on money she didn't have. But Hollywood didn't look for vulnerability to protect it. They looked for vulnerability to exploit it. And Barbara Payton was perfectly, tragically exploitable. She started with modeling, catalog work, advertisements, the kind of jobs that paid rent and got her noticed. Photographers loved her. Agents and studio scouts saw those images and saw potential. Not acting talent necessarily, that was secondary at best, but the potential to photograph beautifully, to fill a very specific Hollywood archetype they were always casting. The blonde bombshell, the femme fatale, the woman men wanted and women envied. Barbara looked the part flawlessly. She had the face, the body, the quality that read as sensuality on screen even when she was just standing still. By 1948, at 21, she was signing studio contracts. First Columbia, then Universal, finally Warner Brothers. The money wasn't enormous by star standards, but it was more than Barbara had ever seen, more than she'd make in years of Minnesota waitressing. The studios went to work grooming their product. They styled her platinum blonde hair to specific specifications, taught her to walk with calculated sexiness, coached her voice to be breathy and inviting, manufactured a background more glamorous than teenage divorce and single motherhood. Barbara Lee Redfield, vulnerable young mother, became Barbara Payton, Hollywood discovery. The transformation was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. Her breakthrough came in 1949 with Trapped, a noir thriller where she played exactly what studios wanted: beautiful, dangerous, morally ambiguous. Critics noticed her screen presence. Audiences noticed her face. Then came Kiss Tomorrow Goodbye in 1950, starring opposite James Cagney in another noir classic. Barbara was luminous, vulnerable and tough simultaneously, the perfect femme fatale who seemed both victim and predator. Warner Brothers saw their investment paying off spectacularly. They put her on magazine covers, arranged publicity romances with approved leading men, crafted narratives about the small-town girl who'd made it through talent and determination. But the studio's control extended far beyond film sets. Warner Brothers dictated every aspect of Barbara's public life with suffocating precision. They approved her dates. Only certain men, preferably other contract players who generate positive publicity. They controlled what she wore to premieres, what she said in interviews, even which parties she could attend. A studio publicist accompanied her to most events, monitoring conversations, steering her away from controversial topics, ensuring she performed Barbara Payton starlet rather than being Barbara Redfield person. When she tried dating someone the studio hadn't approved, they'd threaten to suspend her contract, to withhold paychecks she desperately needed to support her son. The pressure was relentless and invisible to outsiders. Every public appearance was work, every smile performed, every word calculated. Barbara couldn't express opinions that might alienate audiences. She couldn't gain weight or cut her hair or dress differently without studio approval. Her body wasn't hers. It belonged to Warner Brothers, who'd invested in making it profitable and expected return on that investment. She was a product being marketed, and products don't have autonomy or privacy or the right to make personal choices that might affect their market value. The reality behind those glossy narratives was far messier. Barbara was terrified constantly of not being good enough, of being exposed as a fraud, of the studio dropping her when a younger blonde appeared or her looks started to fade. She was 22 years old, responsible for supporting her son back in Minnesota, navigating an industry she didn't understand, surrounded by people whose interest in her was purely transactional. The pressure was crushing. She started drinking to manage anxiety, taking pills to sleep, performing happiness at premieres while feeling hollow inside. The studio knew and didn't care. As long as she showed up on time, hit her marks, and photographed beautifully, her internal state was irrelevant. Beauty was the product they were selling. Her well-being was not their concern. Behind all that glamour and magazine covers was their unbearable pressure nobody acknowledged. Absolutely. Barbara was carrying impossible weight, proving she deserved the contract, supporting her child, managing relationships with powerful men who could make or break her career, maintaining the beauty that was her only real asset. She had no family support in Hollywood, no real friends, just agents, publicists, and executives whose care for her began and ended with her profitability. Every day required performing perfection while dying inside, and nobody, not the studio, not the press, not the fans, cared about the cost as long as she kept looking beautiful on screen. Then came 1951, and everything collapsed. Barbara was involved with two men simultaneously. Franchot Tone, a respected older actor from classic Hollywood, offering stability and respectability, and Tom Neal, a younger actor, volatile and passionate, offering excitement that made her feel alive. She couldn't choose between them. Or perhaps she didn't want to choose, believing somehow she could have both security and passion without consequences. She was 23 years old and still believed promises, still thought things could work out if she just wanted them enough. On September 14, 1951, the situation exploded. Tom Neal arrived at Barbara's apartment on Sunset Strip to find Franchot Tone already there. What started as confrontation escalated into violence. Neal, a former collegiate boxer who'd fought in the Golden Gloves, attacked Tone with professional brutality. The beating lasted several minutes. Tone tried to defend himself but was completely outmatched. By the time it ended, Tone was unconscious on Barbara's floor, his face destroyed. He required immediate hospitalization, broken nose, fractured cheekbone, concussion, severe facial lacerations. Doctors performed emergency surgery, then more surgeries to reconstruct his face. He spent weeks in the hospital, his career and appearance permanently damaged. The press descended like vultures. This wasn't just celebrity gossip. It was violence, scandal, sex, everything that sold newspapers. And Barbara became the story's villain. Not Neal, who'd committed the assault. Not Tone, who'd been beaten unconscious. Barbara. Headlines screamed, "Love triangle ends in blood. Blonde bombshells, men fight to the death. Hollywood's most dangerous woman." Columnists painted her as a femme fatale, straight from the noir films she'd starred in. A woman so desirable, so sexually powerful, she drove respectable men to violence. The fact that she'd thrown no punches, committed no assault, was irrelevant. Her beauty and sexuality had caused chaos, therefore she was guilty. The studio's response was immediate and merciless. Warner Brothers terminated Barbara's contract within 48 hours. Not because she'd broken any laws, she hadn't. Not because she'd failed to fulfill professional obligations. She'd shown up to every shoot, delivered every performance they'd asked for. But because scandal made her toxic, unprofitable, a liability they refused to carry. The executives who'd photographed her, marketed her, profited from her beauty, now acted as if she'd personally betrayed them by becoming controversial. Other studios immediately blacklisted her. Agents stopped returning calls. Projects she'd been attached to found new actresses overnight. At 23 years old, with a son to support and no other marketable skills, Barbara Payton's Hollywood career was finished. Did this scandal mark her downfall, or simply reveal how precarious her position had always been? Both. The Tone Neal fight was the trigger, but the real issue was how completely Barbara's value had been tied to her image, how quickly the industry turned on her the moment she became inconvenient. If she'd been valued for talent, intelligence, anything beyond her looks, maybe she could have survived scandal. But she'd only ever been beautiful, and beauty contaminated by controversy wasn't marketable anymore. The machine had no use for her, so the machine discarded her. The years after the scandal were slow-motion catastrophe. Barbara tried desperately to keep working. Low-budget films, television guest spots, anything. But she was blacklisted by major studios, considered too controversial, too risky. The money evaporated. She married Franchot Tone in 1951, a desperate grasp at respectability and stability, but the marriage was doomed. Tone was physically and psychologically damaged from Neal's beating, and he blamed Barbara for what had happened to him. They divorced after 7 brutal months. She briefly married Tom Neal, the man who'd destroyed Tone for her, discovering too late that passion without stability was just chaos wearing a different face. The descent accelerated through the mid-1950s. Barbara took whatever film work existed, cheap exploitation pictures, crime dramas shot in days with budgets in the thousands rather than millions. She'd show up to sets where directors barely knew her name, where her co-stars were unknown actors hoping for their own breaks. The contrast with Warner Brothers sound stages was devastating. 3 years earlier, she'd been working with James Cagney on A-list productions. Now she was doing scenes in rented warehouses, being paid scale, watching her career die in real time. She kept trying to make comebacks. There were always schemes, always promises from small-time producers who claimed they could resurrect her career. She'd show up to meetings hoping this time would be different. This project would remind Hollywood of her talent. But the meetings led nowhere. The projects fell apart, and Barbara would return to her increasingly shabby apartment, pour another drink, take another pill, try to numb the reality that at 25, 26, 27, she was already washed up, already finished, already being referred to in past tense by an industry that had moved on completely. By the late 1950s, Barbara was drinking heavily. Not socially or recreationally, but drinking to blackout, to oblivion, to escape the reality of being in her 20s and washed up, of having been promised everything and left with nothing. The beauty that had been her passport to Hollywood was fading rapidly under the corrosive effects of alcohol and stress and heartbreak. Her face, once flawless, was bloating and aging prematurely. The studios that had once competed for her signature wouldn't return her phone calls. She needed money desperately. Her son was being raised by family in Minnesota. She couldn't afford to care for him, could barely afford to feed herself. She took whatever work existed, exploitation films with tiny budgets, modeling jobs for increasingly questionable publications, eventually accepting money from men for companionship that crossed progressively blurrier lines. By the late 1950s, Barbara Payton, the woman whose face had graced Life magazine as Hollywood's newest blonde goddess, was working Sunset Boulevard, taking clients in cars and cheap motels, drinking to numb the humiliation of how impossibly far she'd fallen. The cruelty of her situation wasn't just the fall itself. It was how completely the industry abandoned her. Hollywood had taken a vulnerable 19-year-old single mother, exploited her beauty for profit, gave her no support or protection when scandal hit, then blacklisted her from the only profession she knew. What did they expect would happen? Where was she supposed to go? What was she supposed to do when the only marketable skill she had, being beautiful on camera, was taken away, and her beauty itself was being destroyed by the stress of trying to survive? Can anyone escape the shadow of their darkest moments? Barbara tried. In rare moments of clarity between drinking and degradation, she'd attempt small comebacks, Minor acting roles, efforts to get sober, desperate reaches toward the life she'd briefly had. But Hollywood had moved on completely. The industry that had devoured her had zero interest in redemption narratives, no mechanism for helping broken starlets rebuild. They'd found new blonde goddesses to photograph and exploit and eventually discard. Barbara was yesterday's product, used up, of no further value. In 1963, she published a memoir, I Am Not Ashamed. The title was defiant, confrontational, refusing the shame that everyone wanted to project onto her. The content was devastating, raw, unfiltered accounts of her fall from magazine covers to Sunset Boulevard prostitution. She detailed the drinking, the degradation, the men, everything the industry preferred to keep hidden behind glamorous facades. She wrote about being passed around like a bottle at a party, about the studio system that used her up and threw her away, about the hypocrisy of an industry that profited from her beauty, then punished her for the scandal their system had created. Writing the book was itself an act of desperation and defiance in equal measure. Barbara was 35 years old, completely broke, her health failing, and she needed money desperately. But she also needed to be heard, needed people to understand that her story wasn't about moral failure but about a predatory system. She spent months writing in cheap hotel rooms and borrowed apartments, reconstructing her fall in excruciating detail. The process was painful, reliving the humiliations, the betrayals, the moments when she'd been at her lowest. But it was also cathartic, a way of reclaiming her narrative from the gossip columnists and studio publicists who'd controlled it for so long. Publishers were interested but nervous. The content was explosive, naming names, detailing affairs, describing the machinery of Hollywood exploitation with brutal honesty. Some wanted her to soften certain sections, remove names, make it less controversial. Barbara refused. If she was going to tell her story, she'd tell it truthfully without protecting the people and institutions that had destroyed her. The book that finally emerged was uncompromising and raw, pulling no punches about Hollywood's treatment of young actresses or her own descent into prostitution and alcoholism. Some critics called the book brave and honest, a rare glimpse behind Hollywood's glamorous facade. Others dismissed it as sensational exploitation, a desperate grab for money and attention from a has-been. The book sold modestly but didn't resurrect her career or change public perception. It just confirmed what most people already believed. Barbara Payton was a cautionary tale, a warning about what happened to girls who couldn't handle Hollywood's pressures, who made bad choices, who destroyed their own careers through scandal and alcohol. But here's what the book's critics fundamentally missed. Barbara wasn't ashamed because she understood something crucial. She'd been destroyed by a system, not by her own moral failings. Hollywood had taken a vulnerable teenager with limited options, exploited her beauty for maximum profit, provided no support or protection, then abandoned her the instant she became inconvenient. The shame didn't belong to her. The shame belonged to the machinery that chewed up beautiful girls and spit them out without consequence or accountability. She wrote the book not to confess sins but to expose the system, to make people understand that her story wasn't about personal failure but institutional exploitation. Nobody listened. Nobody with power cared. Hollywood continued functioning exactly as it always had, finding new Barbara Paytons to use and discard, learning absolutely nothing from her story except perhaps to be more careful about letting victims publish tell-all memoirs that might damage the industry's carefully maintained image. By the mid-1960s, Barbara was living in poverty, moving between San Diego and Los Angeles, her health systematically destroyed by years of alcoholism. Her beauty, the thing that had once seemed like her greatest asset and her only currency, was completely gone, ravaged by time and trauma and substances. She looked decades older than her actual age. She was essentially homeless, cycling through cheap apartments and sometimes sleeping rough. The woman who'd worn designer gowns to movie premieres was now in thrift store clothes, unrecognizable as the goddess who'd graced those magazine covers just 15 years earlier. She died on May 8, 1967, alone in a rented San Diego room. Heart failure and liver failure, her organs simply giving up after years of relentless abuse. She was 39 years old. The obituaries were brief, perfunctory, lacking the sentimentality usually afforded to dead stars. Most focused on the scandal, the fall, the tragic waste of beauty and potential. Few mentioned she'd been a genuinely talented actress in the handful of major films she'd made. Fewer still questioned Hollywood's role in her destruction, the system's complicity in creating the conditions for her fall. Her funeral was small and sad. Her son, now in his 20s, attended, a young man who barely knew his mother, who'd grown up hearing stories of her fall from grace, who carried the complicated burden of being Barbara Payton's child. A few old acquaintances came, but there were no studio representatives, no former co-stars, no acknowledgement whatsoever from the industry that had built her up and thrown her away. Hollywood had already forgotten Barbara Payton completely. She was just another cautionary tale, another warning whispered to young actresses about the dangers of scandal and drinking, as if those things existed in a vacuum rather than being symptoms of a predatory, exploitative system. The legacy Barbara Payton left is deeply uncomfortable and contested. She's remembered, when she's remembered at all, as a fallen starlet, a tragedy, supposed proof that beauty and fame are dangerous for women who can't handle them properly. Books about Hollywood's dark underbelly always include her story. Documentaries about scandal mention her name. She's become a symbol, a ghost story the industry tells itself to deflect responsibility. Look what happened to Barbara Payton when she made bad choices, when she couldn't control her drinking, when she destroyed her own career with scandal and poor judgment. But that narrative is fundamentally dishonest. Barbara Payton didn't destroy her career. Hollywood destroyed it the moment she became inconvenient to their profit margins. She didn't become an alcoholic because she was weak or morally deficient. She drank to numb trauma inflicted by being used and abandoned by an industry that valued her only as long as she was profitable. She didn't end up working Sunset Boulevard because of character flaws. She ended up there because Hollywood blacklisted her after a scandal she didn't create, offering no path back, no support system, no acknowledgement that they'd engineered the conditions for her fall. The math is simple and brutal. Take a vulnerable 19-year-old single mother, exploit her beauty for maximum profit, provide zero protection or support, abandon her after a scandal she didn't cause, then blacklist her from the only profession she knows. What exactly do you expect will happen? Barbara Payton's story isn't a mystery or a moral failing. It's the utterly predictable result of a system designed to extract maximum value from women's bodies and faces while accepting zero responsibility for what happens when those women are no longer useful to the machine. When Hollywood destroys a woman for being scandalous, while profiting from the scandals it creates, who really deserves the shame? This is the question Barbara tried to ask in I Am Not Ashamed, the question the industry refused to hear. The studio system created the conditions for scandal. They paired her with leading men for publicity, encouraged her to be seen at parties and clubs, marketed her sexuality aggressively, then acted shocked and offended when actual scandal resulted. They profited from her beauty and the attention it generated, then punished her when that attention became negative. The hypocrisy was staggering, but it was also standard operating procedure. In the decades since her death, some have reclaimed Barbara's story as feminist critique. A woman destroyed by patriarchal systems, by male violence, the tone kneel fight she didn't cause, by an industry that commodified female beauty, then discarded women when they became inconvenient. Others still frame her as a cautionary tale about personal responsibility, about choices she made that led to destruction. Both narratives contain elements of truth. Both missed something essential. Barbara Payton was 19 years old when Hollywood got hold of her, vulnerable and desperate for stability, and she was dead at 39, completely used up. 20 years. That's all Hollywood allowed her before throwing her away like garbage. Was she complicit in her own destruction? Of course she was. She drank, made questionable decisions, hurt people who tried to help her. But complicity isn't the same as responsibility. A system specifically designed to exploit vulnerable people doesn't get absolved of guilt because its victims made mistakes along the way. The studio executives who signed her, photographed her, marketed her beauty, then dropped her the instant she became inconvenient. They bear as much responsibility for her death as the alcohol that stopped her heart. More arguably because they had the power to help and chose profit over humanity. But here's perhaps the cruelest aspect of Barbara Payton's legacy. Hollywood learned absolutely nothing from her destruction. The machinery that killed her continued functioning exactly as before, finding new beautiful girls to use and discard, creating new cautionary tales while accepting zero accountability for the pattern. Barbara's story should have been a wake-up call, should have forced the industry to examine how it treated women, how it exploited beauty, how it abandoned people it had made vulnerable. Instead, it became another ghost story, another warning whispered to young actresses arriving in Los Angeles with dreams and desperation. Don't end up like Barbara Payton, as if her fate had been inevitable destiny rather than carefully engineered tragedy. How many Barbara Paytons has Hollywood created since 1967? Beautiful, vulnerable women consumed by the system, then discarded when the cameras moved on. The answer is too many to count. The names change, the specific circumstances vary, but the pattern remains depressingly consistent. Young women, often from difficult backgrounds, arrive in Hollywood with beauty and vulnerability. The industry exploits both, extracting maximum value while providing minimal protection. When scandal or aging or mental health crises make these women less profitable, the machine discards them without ceremony or support. Some survive, many don't. And the industry keeps spinning, finding new products to consume, learning nothing, changing nothing, accepting no responsibility for the trail of destruction it leaves behind. She wrote in her memoir, "I had 1,000 chances and I threw them all away." But that assessment, while emotionally understandable, wasn't accurate. Hollywood gave her exactly one chance, to be beautiful and profitable for as long as those two qualities coincided. The moment she stopped being both simultaneously, all chances evaporated like morning fog. What she threw away wasn't opportunity. It was the illusion that Hollywood had ever cared about her as anything more than a commodity to be used until it lost value. Barbara Payton was a star for a minute and a shadow forever. Not because she failed Hollywood, but because Hollywood failed her. The girl from Cloquet, Minnesota, who went west searching for something better, found something far worse. An industry that packaged vulnerability as sex appeal, marketed beauty until it stopped selling, then threw away the human being like a used product. She spent her final years trying to explain this to anyone who'd listen, trying to make people understand that her story wasn't about personal moral failure, but about systemic exploitation and abandonment. Nobody with power listened. They preferred narratives that blamed her, that suggested she'd squandered gifts rather than been destroyed by the people who claimed to give them. The real caution in Barbara Payton's story isn't about what happens to beautiful women who make mistakes. It's about what happens when an entire industry treats human beings as disposable products, when beauty is valued infinitely more than humanity, when profit is prioritized absolutely over well-being or basic human decency. Hollywood created Barbara Payton, manufactured her image, controlled her career, profited from her beauty. Hollywood destroyed Barbara Payton, abandoned her after scandal, blacklisted her from work, provided zero support as she spiraled. And then Hollywood moved on without pausing, without reflecting, without accepting even a fraction of responsibility for what they'd done. She died alone in a San Diego flophouse at 39, her body broken, her beauty gone, her name reduced to a cautionary tale about the dangers of scandal and poor choices. But the real danger in her story isn't about individual decisions, it's about institutional cruelty, about a system that consumes vulnerable people for profit, then discards them when they're no longer useful. Barbara Payton tried to tell us this in 1963 with I Am Not Ashamed. We didn't listen then. We're still not listening now. And somewhere in Hollywood today, another 19-year-old girl with a beautiful face and no protection is stepping off a bus, walking straight into machinery designed to consume her, and the cycle continues because the industry that killed Barbara Payton learned absolutely nothing from her death except how to hide the bodies more efficiently.